Okay, so I was watching this video with Dan McClellan, and let me make sure I've got the microphone adjusted correctly. And he was responding to a video by Pastor Shervin Youssefian. Is is that an Persian name? Anyway, so in the video, Pastor Shervin is trying to assert that the tetragrammaton is hidden on the superscription or sign that Pontius Pilate has had put up on the crucifix above um, the head of Jesus, which in Mark only says the King of the Jews. It doesn't appear to say anything else but that. So, um, anyway, so he brings out um, a Hebrew form, not an Aramaic form of the words the king, the King of the Jews, and he bases much of the Tetragrammaton on the use of the um, article ha in, uh, or is it called a definite article? Anyway, ha in Hebrew is basically the same as saying the. So it would be it's a prefix that would be very common, right? And then the third letter of the tetragrammaton he bases on the vav, wa, halom, whatever you want to call it, that is the prefix for melech, uh, the Hebrew word for king. Again, none of this is Aramaic, this is Hebrew, and I have to confess that I am not learned on how much Aramaic differs from Hebrew. I know that it differs some because um, I think that the number of Jews that know Aramaic is probably less than the number of Jews that know Hebrew. So, anyway, now one thing that Dan says that maybe from a scholarly consensus is true, but from my personal experience is false. I'll just go ahead and share what he says, and I'm not doing this to you know, uh, like in any way be like, gotcha, I gotcha, Dan. Yeah, you made a mistake on this one or anything like that. It's just, I think that maybe establishment scholars are just not aware of this, and I'm not even sure that traditional Jews are that aware of this, which is kind of crazy for me to say because most any question that a Gentile has ever come up with about the Bible, some Jew already thought of, like, oh, thousands of years ago, right? So it's only someone who is just now beginning to dip their toes into the cool waters of Hebrew and the Hebrew Tanakh, who would think that something that they arrived at is something that no studious Jew has ever discovered on their own, you know. But this is what I've discovered in my studies. But I want to show what Dan says here. because I don't want to misrepresent what he says.
Did.
I don't think this is true.
You see, the Hebrews had a tradition of hiding secret codes in their writing. When they didn't want everyone else to understand, they would conceal a message inside the Hebrew words.
I do believe that this is true. For example, Flavius Josephus reports that the Emperor Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days, whereas Nero's reign was actually closer to 13 years and 8 months, but not exact, apparently. So, not exactly 8 months, in other words. So, anyone who would have known how long Nero actually reigned would have seen that 13 years and 8 days was not correct. However, the only place in the Hebrew Tanakh where 13 years and 8 days occurs is in the chapter on the Abrahamic covenant, where circumcision is discussed, or rather, you could call it bris if you want to call it that, but where uh, the the Hebrew child was supposed to be circumcised at 8 days, and I think that Ishmael was circumcised at 13 years, if I remember correctly. Whereas I think Avram or Avraham was circumcised. Was it at 99 years? Is my memory serving me correctly there? Anyway, who lives to 99 years, you know? Not many. Anyway, so yeah, 13 years and 8 days, it only occurs in the chapter of the Hebrew Tanakh about the Abrahamic covenant and circumcision. So what Josephus is doing is he's telling us that Nero was circumcised, that you could say he committed suicide metaphorically, in that he converted to Judaism and he cut himself in such a fashion, or had himself cut in such a fashion, that he ceased to be Gentile Nero and he became a Jewish infant with a new Jewish name at that point. Anyway, but that's just one example. I've got some other examples that I want to share where I can show. Well, let me play the rest of this.
And the way they would do it is they would use the first letter of consecutive words to put together a message.
So this is not accurate. Acrostics are far more common centuries after the development of the New Testament in languages like Hebrew. But when we see them prior to the first century CE, it's primarily alphabetic acrostics.
Yes. Now, this is, most of us have seen this. I think there's one of the Psalms called the Hallel. I believe each verse of that starts with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet, if I remember correctly. So yeah, there are places where the order of the text seems to be maintained through the use of acrostics. You also have a place where the word, I believe the word Torah, is repeated over and over again with equidistant letter spacing for a certain distance in the Torah. I seem to remember that there might be a place where the letters of the Tetragrammaton are repeated in equidistant letter spacing somewhere in the Hebrew Tanakh. I could be wrong on that. Anyway, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here, right? But it does show that there is some cleverness, shall we say, going on in the Hebrew Tanakh. we we have to remember that this library of literature is what the Jewish people consumed themselves with. This was their entertainment, if you want to call it that. This is their lifestyle. This is what their children were trained up on. So there's some incredible complexity in the Hebrew Tanakh that I think non-Jews are not accustomed to in their own literature. So I want to point you to Daniel. And Daniel chapter 1 verse 7. And now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Now, for the two last names there of the three boys that went into the furnace, the names, or the first letters of their names remain the same. But for Hananiah, whose name is given as Shadrach in the Babylonian culture, the first letter actually changes from, let's see if I can even remember. I get one of these letters confused when I don't practice enough. Yeah, I think this is a het, this letter right here. So this letter het changes to a shin, Shadrach. Now, if you take the first letter of the names that they were changed to, it spells the word, here's shin, mem, and ayin. It spells the word Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4. Hear or actively listen or pay attention, O Israel, the Creator is your deity, the Creator alone. I prefer that translation rather than the Creator is one, because Jesus is pictured as citing this affirmation as the most important commandment in the Gospels, suggesting that this is a commandment of commission, a positive commandment. But if you say that it's the Creator is one, that kind of makes it more of a theological statement. If, however, you translate it the Creator alone, then that's a positive commandment, reinforcing that the Creator is your deity. Anyway, but that's just my personal preference in translation there, and I know that some would take issue with that, but I do agree that the Hebrew deity is one, mathematically singular, not multiple components unified, like some want to pretend, some pro-Trinitarians want to pretend, because the same word echad is used to describe the first day of creation. So if the first day of creation really means 3, then does the second day of creation mean 6? Because 2 times 3 equals 6? It's clearly referring to mathematical singularity. So anyway, so here we see that the 3 boys are referred to as Shema, hearkening back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, in this story where they're being asked to worship a false god. Then, and so I had seen that, I don't know how many years ago, but then I revisited the text, and then I saw that because, wow, things are so much easier to discover with the help of AI now. So I discovered that het and mem and ayin makes the word chema, meaning fury, and that this word fury occurs in, I think, 3 places in in the book of Daniel. One of them, chapter 8, verse 6, and there it is. Het, mem, and oh, that's right. That's right. This form doesn't actually end in an aying, but there is a place in Daniel where fury does end in aying. Let me see if I can find that. Is it Strong's 2533? No. I know it's in there. Let's see, where in the book of Daniel is the word fury spelled CH-M-A? The word translated as fury or raged, spelled CH-M-A, or Hama or Chema, appears in 2 verses in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3, verse 13. And let's see, his fury. So there it is. Het mem ayin. And again, the first letter, if that's not a het, if it's the other letter that makes the ch sound, I apologize. I like I said, when I don't practice, I get those 2 letters confused. Anyway, so there it is. Het mem ayin. And how often does this form occur? This form, where is it? Is it only in 1 place? No, it's in 2 places. Only in the book of Daniel does it occur in that form. Whereas, the other form, see, because I asked here, if the word chema, fury, occurs 164 times in the Hebrew Tanakh and 3 times in the book of Daniel, is it used inordinately? And the AI says, yes, it is used more frequently in Daniel, even when accounting for the book's shorter length. To make a direct objective comparison, we calculate the frequency of usage per 1,000 words for both the entire Tanakh and the book of Daniel. And so that's actually less. See, sometimes AI gets things backwards, man. Here in the book of Daniel, it occurs 0.54 occurrences per 1,000 words. whereas the book of Daniel contains roughly 9,000 Hebrew and Aramaic words. So the Daniel frequency equals 1,000 or 0.33 occurrences per 1,000 words. So that's actually less. But then if you add the 2, so if 3 is 0.33, then it would be 0.55 occurrences per 1,000 words, which would bring the book of Daniel in alignment with the rest of the Tanakh as to the frequency of usage of the word Hema. So if you calculated in the 2 occurrences of the variant form ending in ayin with the 3 occurrences ending in a hey, then you would get something in line with the rest of the Tanakh. So that's interesting. But anyway, it looks like the AI kind of got that wrong. But is this the one? Yeah. So here's the form Hema with ending with an H, and this occurs. Where is it? The total. Oh, only 124. Oh, so I actually got that wrong. 124 times. So let me see. If the word Hema Fury occurs 100, come on, 124 times in the Hebrew Tanakh, and we'll factor in the extra 2 times in the book of Daniel. Is it used more frequently in the book of Daniel given Daniel's length in comparison to the entire Tanakh? No, the word Hema is not used more frequently in the book of Daniel when accounting for its length. While it appears 124 times in the entire Tanakh and 5 times in Daniel, calculating the rate of frequency shows that it is used more densely across the broader biblical corpus than in Daniel. So across the Tanakh is 0.4 instances per 1,000 words. But then it says that, so again, it got it backwards, man. What? Like AI just comes to the opposite conclusion sometimes. So Daniel actually does use the word fury more often than in the rest of the Hebrew Tanakh. Okay, so let's not get lost here. So this is an example of where the Hebrew Tanakh is using the first letter of a bunch of listed words, in this case, proper names, to create code words that are used in the text or have certain baggage and meaning to them that one can apply to the text that you're reading. The reason I ever discovered this, I'm not sure if I discovered it before I read Robert Eisenman's James the Brother of Jesus, but there was a passage either in James the Brother of Jesus or in his book The New Testament Code where he lists off a bunch of early messianic religious groups around the 1st century, I think, and he doesn't list them in any order that seems to make any sense. He doesn't list them alphabetically, doesn't seem to list them chronologically as far as I could tell. So then I looked at the first letter of each name of each of these sects, these religions, if you want to call them that he lists in his book, and they spell the word enemy except with an I at the end, which you wouldn't get a a Y, because if you could only convert the first, 10 letters of the English alphabet. Let me see, enemy. Well, you would need a sect that had a name beginning with the letter Y in order to spell the word enemy. His listing spelled it Enemi, enemy. It's just he didn't have a Y sect at his disposal. Now, I don't know if this was coincidental. I don't know if Robert Eisenman was writing in code to someone, or why would he do that, and to whom would he be communicating this code, or was it intended to be subliminal? It's very weird. If it's intentional, it's hard to understand why he would have done it. And if it was coincidental, it seems like an awfully incredible coincidence. Now, I'm an INFJ personality type, so I tend to be sensitive to patterns, and my intuition, as it were, picks up on things, even when I can't articulate them, right? So it might be that subconsciously I picked up on this pattern, even though there is listing going on elsewhere in James, the brother of Jesus, and I haven't as yet detected any other listing there. For one, it's a very long book, and I'm not about to study it for the rest of my life, because anyone who's read it knows that it's a difficult read, and like Flavius Josephus is a difficult read. So, and I'm not about to read Flavius Josephus for the rest of my life the way one might read the Bible, So, and in the Hebrew Tanakh, there are places where it looks like there is this, what I call, listing going on. But because of my small Hebrew vocabulary, I am maybe not so able to detect what the code words being spelled out are. Also, I think I have not yet read a place in either the Mishnah or the Talmud or any other Jewish work that I've read, which aren't that many in number, that reveals that traditional Jews are aware of listing, or this use of acrostics to create code words across words. Usually, in traditional Judaism, they're more concerned with gematria, which is converting a word to a number and vice versa, even if it's only because your vocabulary in gematria, has been established. You're able to do it the other way. For example, the rabbi that I studied with, he once converted a number into a word, into a Hebrew word, and I think I startled his wife, because I said, "Wait," and and I think that startled her. But I was like, "Did you just convert a word or a number into a word?" And he said, "Yeah," like it was, of course. And I was like, "Well, how do you do that? Because the number of combinations would seem to be too great to be able to do that." And he said, "Oh, it's just because I already know that word has this numerical value. So I guess once you have the vocabulary in gematria, you're able to do it. I do not." have that vocabulary. Anyway, so in traditional Judaism, they seem to be mostly concerned with gematria, and I have not as yet, as far as I can remember, encountered a place where in traditional Judaism they are able to take the first letter of listed words of the same type or classification and arrive at a code word that provides additional meaning to a text. So whereas the secular scholarly establishment may not be aware of this, it may also be true that traditional Jewish scholars may not be aware of this. Anyway, so let's move on. Now we've already covered that, and we've covered this. Need to close some of these windows. It's getting out of order here. And what's this? Okay, that's our next point. And covered that. What's this? Covered that. What's this? And we've covered that. Okay, so back to the video.
Where the first letter of each line is a consecutive letter of the alphabet, but they tend not to hide words or messages or names in acrostics in this period.
I don't believe that's true. I just don't believe that's true. I believe that Jewish writers were extremely clever and about using codes. It's just very possible, for reasons I'm about to reveal, that well, he even touches on this point, so I'll let him go ahead and touch on it.
There are ciphers and cryptography and things like that that are in use at Qumran, but there are very, very different techniques going on there that don't really have much to do with acrostics. But also acrostics aren't really about hiding things that are secret so nobody else can see them, because that's...
With that, I agree to a degree. I agree with it to a degree because Jewish children are being trained on the Hebrew Tanakh. That's their scholastic text. That's their school textbook. And that text is training them in grammar. It's training them in mathematics. It's training them in logic puzzles. It's training them in critical thinking, asking questions. It's all of the sciences that Jews had at their disposal in the Hebrew Tanakh. As far as I can tell from my familiarity with it.
Not incredibly effective. The message tends to sit on the surface.
So what he's saying is, if you put something in code, that's not very effective because the message tends to sit on the surface. People tend to read the Peshat or the straight. Is it the Peshat that's the straight meaning? Yes, the Peshat is the plain literal or contextual meaning of the text. However, it is a common misconception that Peshat means a shallow or word-for-word surface reading. In Jewish tradition, Peshat is the foundational approach to biblical exegesis and requires deep, intensive study. It relies heavily on context, understanding the immediate literary setting and the overall narrative. For example, Christians love to cite passages condemning Israel for their whoredoms and abominations and their sins and not realizing that some of these passages are actually in reference to the northern kingdom of Israel, who was invaded and deported by the Assyrians before the southern kingdom of Judah was. So they were actually more in error than the southern kingdom of Judah was. And so never mind that the whole process of deportation from the land and then regathering into the land is a process of corporate teshuva or repentance. That you don't get to like cite these passages as evidence that the children of Israel are perpetually evil or perpetually sinful. It doesn't work that way. You don't know your Bible very well if you think that. Anyway, so this is on the screen. You can read this if you want. I was just double checking myself because I do have a tendency to make errors when I speak off the cuff. So, so while I agree that it's not effective to encode things because the surface reading is mostly what gets read, Jews are actually trained to not just read the Peshat, but to the four levels of biblical interpretation. Remez is part of an ancient Jewish exegetical framework commonly abbreviated as Pardes. Yeah, I always get that wrong. I always say Remez instead of Pardes. So, a Hebrew acronym for orchard or paradise. Peshat, the literal plain or direct meaning of the text. Remez, the allegorical hinted or deeper meaning. Hinted. This is so important right here. That there are things that are being hinted in the Hebrew Tanakh that if you're not a person who's trying to live according to the 613 mitzvot commandments of the Torah, you're just not going to get it. You are not going to get the hint. Darash, the homiletical or comparative study, for example, Midrash, and Sod, the secret, mystical, or esoteric meaning, for example, Kabbalah. So translations typically work with the Peshat, the literal plain or direct meaning of the text. These three levels of meaning largely get stripped away in a translation. So these non-Jews who are reading their little Bible translations, which are often biased and flawed in and of themselves, are at best getting the literal plain or direct meaning of the text. But they're not getting these other three levels of meaning in the Hebrew text. But these other three levels of meaning are what Jewish children are being taught when they're learning the Hebrew Tanakh.
So this is not an incredibly accurate description of what went on within first century CE Judaism.
And completely unknowingly, that is exactly what Pilate had done. When you write Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews in Hebrew, and take the first letter of each word, it spells out an amazing word. And that word is Yahweh.
So we got two problems here. One of them a pretty small issue, the other utterly catastrophic for this claim. So here is the image that this content creator put on the screen. And in the red in the middle, you see Hebrew text. And then in the black underneath, you see a transliteration that is close to that Hebrew text, but is actually not quite that Hebrew text.
So here I agree with Dan. It is in the Gospel of John, the way this is laid out, It is somewhat surprising how close to the Tetragrammaton this is in Hebrew. Whether it is in Aramaic, I don't know. But, however, the second and fourth letters of the Tetragrammaton are covered by this article ha, which is basically the same as the, right? So a very common thing, very common prefix in Hebrew, ha. And then it is like Dan says, this vav, wa, or kolom right here, where it says umalech, where you might expect it to say vimelech. The word and is not given to us in the Greek, and that was something I wanted to check out. Let me see. Jesus of Nazareth, Ho, King of the Jews, but we're looking at it in Greek. Judaios, that's Ho. Oh, it says tone from the root of. And then this is King. So we should be seeing an and here, but we're not. We're seeing a Ho. So there doesn't really seem to be any support for an and there in the Greek. What about the Latin Vulgate? Just, just to check. Not because it would mean anything. That's not it. Didn't they used to have the Latin Vulgate in this in blueletterbible.com? There it is. Rex Judaeorum, meaning Jews, I guess. So the script in there is just Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum. So there's not even like any articles that I can see in Latin. So no help there. So I have to agree with what Dan says about this, that I mean it's really close. It's really close. But yeah, this lack of an and is not helpful to the pastor's argument. Let's see. Jesus the Nazarene and King of the Jews. Yeah, I mean the and's just not there. So so and then at the end Dan cautions people about this claim is an example of post-biblical dogmatic development being projected onto the biblical text. He urges viewers to think critically about such claims and to verify them with expert scholarly commentary rather than accepting internet spread theories that confirm specific ideologies. Well, I'm about to get you into some specific ideologies that are post-biblical and dogmatic, because in researching this video, and specifically the passage in John was very helpful, but I came upon, let's see, So I said, what is the historical evidence in the 30s AD for Jesus being called King of the Jews on the sign at his crucifixion? So now the explanation is that the Jewish authorities delivered him up for religious reasons, whereas Jesus could not be crucified for religious reasons. Under Roman law, he would have had to have been crucified for political reasons. So in Mark, it says, and the superscription of his accusation was written over. Now, I don't know if this is just like a repetition or if they're saying that maybe his accusation, the original accusation was there on the sign, and then they wrote over it with the King of the Jews in order to give him a political accusation. I don't know, but anyway, the thing that I noticed though was these opening words from Google AI. The historical evidence for the sign, or titulus. There's a similar word we can use. I think it's titular, but titulus, the Latin placard, designating Jesus as King of the Jews during his crucifixion. It relies primarily on early literary sources and established Roman legal practices. So you can read all this if you want. But what I noticed was this word titulus, which is a Latin word, apparently. And apparently there's a relic called the Titulus Crucis relic currently housed in Rome. That's probably worth researching just because I've never heard of that. So next I asked Google AI, how was Titulus spelled in Latin and how was Titus spelled in Latin? And this is how they're spelled. So if you remove the added LV, then you get the name Titus. So the titulus is placed above Jesus's head, and it just says the King of the Jews. Now, after Vespasian died, who was effectively King of the Jews? The Emperor of Rome. And who was that? That was Titus Flavius. The same Titus who laid siege to Jerusalem after exterminating Jewish men, women, and children down through the Galilee and into Judea. And the same Titus who, after breaching the walls of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple of Jerusalem. He was also, by the way, the last man, a Gentile, mind you, to stand in the holy place of the temple of Jerusalem. A Gentile standing in the holy place of the temple in Jerusalem. So, anyway, I think I've saved this. So, now, as we already saw here, the titulus is called a superscription or an epigraph, or in other words, a super or over writing. And then again, it says epigrapho as a verb, I think, saying that it was written over. So, and that's Epigraphe is Greek Strong's Concordance 1923. Not terribly important, but I'm going with Dan that Mark is probably the original form of this superscription, because of Markan priority and because the later Gospels obviously add layers to the superscription that aren't there in Mark. I think some apologists try to say, well, Mark was just writing for brevity. He's just it's just the bare bones of the Gospels or something like that. But this is what happens to lies, is that they tend to get accretions piled upon them, layers upon layers of more lies on top of other lies. So that we get John 19, where we get the form Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, here, in John 19:19, and Pilate wrote a title. Here it's called a title, and the Greek word is titlos, or titlus, whatever the case. It's Greek Strong's number 5102. 5102. Okay, well, what about the name Titus in the New Testament? So this is Titus chapter 1, verse 4, to Titus, mine own son after common faith, blah, blah, blah. And here, that word is Titos, or Titus. And it's Greek Strong's number 5103. So these two words are neighbors alphabetically, or rather alphabetically. Sorry. If it's Hebrew, I call it alphabetically, but in Greek, it's definitely alphabetically. So, and we see that it's kind of hard to do here. Maybe, where is it? Here it is. Can I do it here? Yeah. Okay, so I tried to highlight this so you could see it. So that letter making the L sound is the added letter, or the letter that if we remove it, the word becomes Titus, the name of the emperor who had Flavius Josephus with him in Rome to write the Jewish War, or the Wars of the Jews, or the Roman War against the Jews, whatever you want to call it. I think is it called Bella Judaicum? Anyway. And yeah, and if you'll look, you'll see that the dating for the Gospels spans roughly the same duration of time as the dating for the reigns of the Roman Flavian emperors, Vespasian, and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. So maybe this is the real secret message. Now, Dan can say, because scholarly consensus is totally against the Caesar's Messiah thesis, right? Oh, I'm so scared of scholarly consensus. That this is post-biblical imposing of my viewpoints in order to bolster up my ideological perspective, right? But the thing is, I didn't come up with Caesar's Messiah. Joseph Atwill did. And there was also another gentleman called Cliff Carrington who had a website for the Flavian hypothesis and still does, I think. So I wasn't the man to notice this. I was only the man who was able to independently confirm for myself the Caesar's Messiah thesis because I was already fairly fluent in the Gospels through my very young days as a Mormon missionary, then later as a student of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then later as a floater through these various I don't know if you want to call it sects of Christianity. For example, Messianic Judaism, the Ebionites, the Sacred Name movement, the Torah Faith movement. You know, I floated through all of these in an effort to get answers to my questions. And when I was finally on my own, I started reading the Hebrew Tanakh in chronological order, and then that was when I, in effect, became a Ben Noach or a Noachide, which is kind of, you could call it Judaism for Gentiles, or in other words, Torah for Gentiles. So some people call it Judaism light, but that's many of these characterizations might be considered offensive or inaccurate or imprecise in their descriptions, but they're helpful in describing what the B'nai Noach or the Noachides are to people who have never heard of them, right? In essence, they're the same as the God-fearers in the Christian New Testament, who are described in the Christian New Testament. But see, these God-fearers really, I think, only existed up until the time that the Roman Flavians destroyed the temple and offered Christianity as an alternative to Judaism. Then after that, the Gentiles flocked to Christianity instead of to Judaism, although I think there are examples of large-scale conversions to Judaism after the first century, but usually these are seen very negatively by Christians who want to believe that the Jews were conquered and destroyed as a people and cast off by God. Anyway, so then I started reading Flavius Josephus's The Wars of the Jews critically. And then I was tipped off about Caesar's Messiah, and then I was able to see how much better a fit the Caesar's Messiah thesis is to explain the advent of Christianity than even Christianity's explanations are. Like the Caesar's Messiah is far more plausible, but the problem with the Caesar's Messiah thesis is that it makes the entirety of the historical Jesus industry and the establishment academia look like a bunch of fools. And because their livelihoods and their professions are tied up in their reputation and their authority, their appeal to authority by intellect, I guess you could say, this is threatening to them because, the thing is, like, Joseph Atwill was a fool before this. He was taken in as much by this story to a degree as the rest of us were. We all believed to a certain extent, the surface narrative of the Gospels, but eventually he was the one. He was really the Joseph the seer of the latter days, who really saw the truth of the matter, and the rest of us are just kind of building upon his discoveries and making further corroborating and supportive discoveries of our own. but AI, trained on the scholarly consensus, assumes that the scholarly consensus is correct. It is biased towards the scholarly consensus, and where it makes huge allowances for the scholarly consensus, it demands instead very it just makes very demanding requirements of the Caesar's Messiah thesis. Like, for example, I had AI basically tell me it wants like a written signed statement from the Roman Flavians saying that they were involved in the invention of the Gospels, you know? Yeah. As hidden as it has been all this time, I don't think we're going to get one. But in this case, we have something that looks like one. But if I threw this at AI, especially when it doesn't learn from its conversations with its users, that we would have to actually publish a book or a paper that would get exposed to the mainstream, right? And then the mainstream would actually have to adopt this perspective so that it started becoming consensus. Only then, I think, would the AI LLM that's trained on the new data, only then would it accept the possibility that this is true. Like AI, if I threw this at AI, it would not accept this as evidence that Titus was in any way involved with the Gospels. So, but there you have it. I mean, the titulus or titlos in John, titulus in Latin. If you just drop a couple characters, or in the case of titlos, drop one character, you get the name of the man that the Caesar's Messiah thesis says is represented by the literary disguise of Jesus. So, let's see, close this. Yeah, so it definitely happens in Latin, and it definitely happens in Greek. I mean, we can't really see it happening in Latin in the Greek New Testament, but we can see it happening even more forcefully in the Greek. That this sign is a sign. There you go. You know, a wicked and perverse generation seeketh a sign, right? There shall no sign be given it but the sign of Jonah. What does the word Jonah mean, or what does the name Jonah mean? Jonah means dove. What does the name Titus mean? It means dove. We know this from only one source I've seen so far, and that is our Italian surnames. So the wicked and perverse generation is given a sign. That sign is Titus. And that sign, or titlos or titulus, above the head of Jesus on the crucifix, is, if you drop one or two letters, the very name of the Roman Flavian general turned emperor whose reign coincides with the invention or the dating typically assigned to the Gospels. You know, I don't know how much more you could want. I mean, because The New Testament is not Jewish literature. You can read it and you can see this is not Jewish literature. The book of Revelation might be an exception, but I really don't think so. I don't think so. This is Gentile literature that is appropriating Jewish ideas, words, and concepts and retooling them into a more Rome-friendly religion. That's why this New Testament, so-called, this New Covenant, had to be tacked on to the Hebrew Tanakh, because it didn't have the authority or acceptance of the Jewish community. It was Gentile literature for Gentiles, and that's why Gentiles subscribe to the Christian canon of the Bible and not the Jewish canon of the Bible. This is why the Jewish community does not accept the Christian canon of the Bible. You know, it's not their literature. If you want to look at Messianic Jewish literature of the first century, you would be looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you would see that the Dead Sea Scrolls are very different from the New Testament. Really, the Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty much the New Testament of the period for Jews. In fact, the Dead Sea Scroll writers even call themselves, I believe it's the New Covenant in the land of Damascus. So, but the two bodies of literature, the New Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls, are extremely different from one another. Let's see. So you can check out Dan's video if you want to watch it more in depth, and he is reacting to Pastor Shervin. I think Dan is generally correct in his reaction to the pastor. I think the pastor is surprisingly close to being correct, but I think he's engaging in wishful thinking, and which is pretty typical of arguments along these lines with Christians. You know, it's par for the course. At some point, though, you know, if you're a truth-seeking Christian, you're going to engage in some real investigative study. You're going to find out, like some believers I once was acquainted with, that that Paul's quotations of the Hebrew Tanakh are playing very fast and loose, so that if you read the quotations in their original context, you will see that the context of the verse being quoted is often of diametrically opposed meaning than what Paul is using the passage to assert. So eventually you're going to study yourself out of the idolatry of Christianity. And, you know, the problem is that Christians, and I think this is part of the aim of the Roman Flavians, is that so much of a person's faith and hope for a Christian gets bound up in the claims of the Gospels that if they lose their faith in Christianity, then they lose their faith in the whole Bible. But they need to understand that now, you know, atheist scholars, you know, they're going to be completely okay with that. But just because the New Testament, as such, might be in error or false, that does not mean that the Hebrew Tanakh, that never asked for the New Testament is also false. That doesn't logically follow. You would actually have to point to internal evidences in the Hebrew Tanakh to prove that like an individual book or some aspect of the Tanakh was false, right? Because the Tanakh is also a library, just like the New Testament is a library. They are both Bibles in that sense. So, but the tendency of people is to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, to just get disgusted and throw it all out. And I think this is why Matthew 7 says that this is the law and the prophets. Enter in at the narrow gate, few there be that find it. Speaking of the Torah and the prophets, very few people who aren't born into Judaism come to knowledge and acceptance of the Torah and the prophets in in what the prophets are actually trying to say, not in what Christians say the prophets are saying, right? So anyway, that's my reaction to Dan's video. I just wanted to agree with him on this point of what the superscription says in the Gospel of John. It's surprisingly close to the Tetragrammaton, but it just doesn't get into the end zone. It doesn't make a touchdown on this one. And I also wanted just to reveal to him what the academic establishment doesn't seem to know yet about how words are being encoded in the Hebrew Tanakh using the first letter of a series of words of the same classification. And how we're able to derive code words from these lists that add meaning to the passages in which they occur. It's something I discovered this years ago. I've lately been discovering more of them with the help of AI. This is not gematria-based Bible codes. This is something more specific than that. Because just a single word, Shema, it doesn't, that's not going to really mean much to a Gentile. Just the word, fury, Chema, is not going to mean much to a Gentile. But when you couple it with the context of the story, or you couple it with other uses of that same word, and I wish I could find the rabbi who was teaching, is it Rabbi Orr? No, that's not what I meant. There was a rabbi who was putting, or Sameach Audio. There was a rabbi who was putting teachings on the Tanakh, and he was using this method that used very similar connection, thematic connection, where one word is used in one place and then it's used elsewhere in the Tanakh, but the use of that word elsewhere in the Tanakh harkens back to the original use of the word, and in so doing adds meaning to the later story. And I've forgotten that rabbi's name, and I wish I had it with me still in my brain, because um, he put out some truly amazing lessons about uh, about the Tanakh. So anyway, I'll close this, and yeah, I'll just end this video here. Sorry I got long-winded about it, but that's how I do sometimes.